And so this is gonna sound weird, but the way to fix it is to shave it. Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Seasonal Sewing. My name is Gwen and this is my sewing/DIY channel. I do mostly vintage inspired projects here, and the big project that I'm working on at the moment is building my autumn-winter capsule. So I've made plans to sew a number of seasonal appropriate pieces to complement things that I already have in my wardrobe to build a capsule wardrobe. As of now, I've already made a 70s inspired floral blouse, a dark green circle skirt, and the project that I'm working on today is a sleeveless princess seam jumper. I'll be using this vintage Simplicity 7864 to sew the jumper, and the fabric that I'll be using is this corduroy in a deep red, rusty, dark brown kind of shade. Personally, I think both the fabric and the color are perfect for fall, and I love how this jumper gives so much potential for layering, which is perfect for autumn winter in Texas, where sometimes you can potentially feel like it's summer in the middle of winter. This is also going to be my first time working with corduroy fabric, which is kind of nerve-wracking but also exciting at the same time. I've done quite a bit of research in preparation for the sewing project, so I think that's going to help me a lot along the way. And now before we get sick and tired of me talking, let's get right into the sewing project. And now, because it was my first time working with this sewing pattern, the first thing that I did before jumping straight into the sewing project was to empty the content of the pattern envelope to check that all the pattern pieces were present. And fortunately for me, they were. And next, as usual, I compared the pattern pieces with my body sloper to have an idea of how the pattern would fit on my body and to decide if I wanted to make any adjustments to the pattern. And over here, I think you can see that the armholes for the pattern for this jumper are lower and the shoulders are narrower, and it's all supposed to be part of the design. There's a little bit of ease in the body as well, but I just really felt like it was all supposed to be part of the design, so I didn't end up making any changes to the pattern. So I didn't have to make any changes in terms of the sizing of the bodice, but I did have to change the length of the jumper. Using a measuring tape and starting from the shoulder point of the dress pattern, I measured out where the hemline is supposed to be for the dress to sit right above my knees. And then I also added 2 more inches as hem allowance. And then using the measuring tape again, I measured out the excess that I had to take off for every single pattern piece. Then I gave all the pattern pieces a good press so they would sit nice and flat on the fabric when I'm laying them for cutting. So corduroy fabrics are made up of these vertical ridges called wales, and they are plush to the touch. They feel smoother when you run your hand against it in one direction and a little bit rougher in the other direction. I decided to cut my pattern pieces with the texture of the corduroy running smooth from the hem to the shoulders, because apparently from what I read, this is what gives the final product a brighter color. And before I started cutting the pattern pieces out, I also spent a hideous amount of time trying to make sure that the grain line was parallel to the wales. The translucent sewing paper pattern made this a little easy, but at some point I felt like my eyes were starting to play tricks on me as well. So I also used this method of aligning an opaque piece of paper along the wales and then placing the translucent paper pattern over it. So yeah, it took me a while, but I did get to a point where I felt confident and comfortable enough to cut the fabric. And here are all the pattern pieces. We have 2 center front pieces, we have 2 side front pieces, we have 1 center back piece that's cut on the fold, and we have 2 side back pieces. Excuse me, Shiloh? I forgot to include them in the previous shot, but I also had the armhole facing, the back neck facing, and the front facing. So according to the instructions of the pattern, I'm supposed to start with making the bound buttonholes first, but I don't think I'm mentally ready for that, so I'm gonna start with the smaller, more manageable pieces first before I actually get started on the bound buttonholes. So here's what I started with first. I started with sewing the shoulder darts on the center back piece of the dress first, and then I placed the side back and the center back pieces together and sewed them along the princess seams. Okay, that wasn't a lot, but that was practically all that I could do before I arrived at the inevitable, which was to make the bound buttonholes. Pay attention and get ready because we're going to have a short and sweet bound buttonhole tutorial coming right up. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the gold button that I'm using for my jumper. So the pattern suggests using 5/8 inch wide buttons, but I really wanted to use the secondhand, maybe vintage, I can't remember where I got them from, 1 inch wide gold buttons instead. And so I had to adjust the buttonhole placement on the pattern. So this is where the first buttonhole was meant to be according to the pattern, but this is where my first buttonhole ended up. So this is like a guide to first buttonhole placement that I learned from a dressmaking teacher years ago, and this is how it goes. You need to mark out the stitch line on the pattern, and then you need to place the buttonhole right against the stitch line, and the first buttonhole is right under the button. So as you can see, the width of the button affects the first buttonhole placement. So my first buttonhole actually ended up being 1/2 inch lower than the first buttonhole marked out on the pattern. It might not seem like a big deal, but if you're using big gold buttons like I am for this project, it's going to be a big design focal point, and if the placement is a little off, it might actually affect how the dress looks overall in the end. So after figuring out where the first buttonhole was meant to be, I kind of just eyeballed the rest of the buttons and just placed them where I felt it would look pleasing. And the distance between each buttonhole ended up to be 4 inches. And here's our super short and sweet bound buttonhole tutorial. First, I marked out the buttonholes. Then I drew a rectangle around each buttonhole line. The breadth of the rectangle is 3/8 of an inch, and the length of the rectangle is the button width plus another 1/4 inch. Then I cut some 3x3 inch wide fabric squares in the same corduroy fabric and pinned them to the dress fabric above the buttonholes, right sides together. Next, using the sewing machine, I stitched around the rectangles. Next, I drew little triangles on each end of the rectangle and cut the outline out using sharp fabric scissors. Next, I pushed the fabric square from the right side to the wrong side of the dress pattern piece, and at this stage, you should see a rectangular hole that looks like this. Next, I folded the fabric square to make flaps, which are called the lips for the bound buttonholes. Next, I basted the lips shut so they would stay in place for the next step. Finally, I turned the dress pattern piece over and stitched the fabric square along this line, making sure that my stitches catch on to the little triangular flap as well. And that's part 1 of the short and sweet bound buttonhole tutorial. Once the first part of the bound buttonholes were done, I moved on to sewing the center front and the side front pieces together. So now we have the left and right pieces of the front and the back, and we're going to put them together along the shoulder seams and the side seams. So, okay, I need to come in to talk a little bit about the seams. If you have been here for a while, you know that I usually just finish my seams with zigzag stitches, and that's usually enough for a lot of fabrics that I use, which is mostly cottons and polycottons. But this being corduroy, which is a fabric that frays really easily, I didn't think that zigzag stitches would be enough, and I decided to finish my seams with seam binding, i.e. making bound seams. I started off with using this dark brown seam binding that I already have in my stash, and I actually ended up using most of it for just the facing. I have other seam bindings in my stash, but they're not in colors that go with this rusty red for my dress jumper. So I went on eBay and I bought some more vintage seam binding, because I am a sucker for vintage sewing notions. And I got 3 packs of this seam binding in this color called Ginger. So it's not the most perfect color, but I feel like it's still kind of coordinating and it would still go with this rusty red color of my corduroy fabric. And it was still not enough. So I ended up just buying this other brand called Hug Snug, which is like a 100-yard worth of seam binding in this other light brown. And so now I have like a lot of the seam binding in this color, which I should have just done right at the start. Anyway, that's what happened. So yeah, moral of the story, if you're gonna be finishing seams on a design with princess seams, which is a lot of seams, just, bulk purchase your seam binding. Anyway, this is how I finished my seams with seam binding. I pressed the seams open, placed the seam binding on the right side of the seam and stitched it in place, then trimmed a little bit of that allowance and flipped it to the underside of the seam and stitched in the ditch. I guess all that time and trouble was really worth it because this is how the inside of the dress looks with the seam binding. Not too bad for different colors for the seams. And next, I pinned the front facing to the dress right sides together and sewed them together. Corduroy is also a pretty bulky fabric, so I had to take extra measures to reduce the bulk in the seams. I reduced the bulk in the seams in the facing by cutting away one of the layers of the seams, and I also cut off a little corner of that seam in the V neckline so that the neckline would turn out nice and sharp. So I could remove bulk in the front facing by cutting a layer of the seams away, but the shoulders were actually really bulky as well because there's so many layers of fabric coming together. I can't quite show you in the camera, but you can feel it. The bulkiness couldn't be reduced by cutting layers of fabric away because of the way the seam is. And so this is gonna sound weird, but the way to fix it is to shave it. And I can prove it to you with my digital calipers because I'm a nerd. So this is how thick this little corner of the shoulder seam is. It's about 4 millimeters thick. So basically I used this basic disposable Gillette razor to shave off the fluff on the corduroy fabric because the fluff is the thing that's adding to the bulkiness in the seams. I actually tried using one of my husband's electric shaver, but it just didn't work as well. And this is the thickness of the same seam after shaving. It's a big difference of 0.7 millimeters. Okay, maybe not that big, but you can definitely feel it with your hands. I'm serious, it really made a difference. And then I continued to reduce bulk in the armholes by cutting away one of the layers of the seams, shaving the armpits, and after that I understitched all the facings. After that, I pinned the facings in place and stitched them to the dress with a slanted blind stitch. So with this slanted blind stitch, the stitches on the wrong side of the dress are slanted, and I'm only picking up about like 2 to 3 threads of the corduroy fabric on the right side. And you can see me flipping the dress over to the right side just to check that, it's almost invisible. And for this corduroy fabric, I tried to have my little stitches going between the wheels. And this is how the armhole facings look after they've been stitched in place. And now we're back to part 2 of the short and sweet bound buttonhole tutorial. Time to sew the buttonholes on the facing of the dress. First, undo the basting stitches on the bound buttonholes on the right side of the dress. Then cut out fabric squares in the same 3 by 3 inch dimensions using a lightweight fabric because we don't want more bulk in the facing, and mark out a rectangle in the same size as your original bound buttonhole. Once all the fabric squares are marked, pin them to the facing of the dress. Make sure you have all 4 corners of the rectangle on the facing side and the right side of the dress matched up. After that, sew the fabric square onto just the facing layer of the dress along the rectangle, just like before. And just like before, draw the little triangles in the rectangle and cut along the outline. Then push the square through the hole to reveal your beautiful rectangular buttonhole. Then pin the facing to the dress, aligning the buttonholes on the right side of the dress and on the facing of the dress together, and stitch them together, you guessed it, by hand. So over here on the facing side, I've got visible slanted stitches, and on the right side of the dress, I've got the stitches snug along the outline of the rectangle so you can't see them. I ended up with some unevenness in the hem, probably from the time that I was modifying the length of the dress. I basically just eyeballed the hem at this stage and just trimmed it so that the hem ended up being in one smooth curve. More seam binding action! Well, I'm glad that I got to make full use of the 100 yards worth of my Hug Snug seam binding. Actually, I still have quite a number of yards left, obviously. Anyway, this is how I finished the hem for my dress. I stitched the seam binding to the right side of the hem, then flipped the seam binding over and top stitched it down and pinned the hem in place, and guess what's gonna happen next? Yes, more hand sewing. Ta-da! And as you can see, I've made little pleats along the hem, and that's because this hem is a little curved, and so there was a bit of fullness that I had to ease using little pleats. So close to finishing. Now to sew the buttons, I pinned the left and right sides of the dress together, aligning them along the center front edge, and then I marked out the point where I'm supposed to sew the button by inserting my needle about 1/8 of an inch from the end of the buttonhole. So instead of marking out the buttons while I am cutting the fabric, I usually just use this method to determine where the buttons are supposed to go at this stage of sewing. I find this method more accurate and more efficient because things might have, shifted a little bit in the process of sewing, and you really just want to use the buttonholes that's already in the garment to decide where the buttons need to be. At first I thought I didn't want the pockets on the side, but putting it on now, I feel like I want the pockets on the side. So I'm gonna go back to cutting the pocket pieces and sewing it on the dress. I dug out this maroon thrifted bed sheet to use as the lining for the pocket, and obviously the main side of the pocket is cut using the same corduroy fabric. It's kind of an odd shaped pocket, so I decided to mark the stitch line using this, what do you call it, like tracing paper, yes, tracing paper and tracing wheels, so that I'll have an easier time on the sewing machine. More haste, less speed, because I was trying to rush so much that I forgot to leave a little gap to turn the pockets inside out, so I had to do some unpicking. So I did that, and then I trimmed the seam allowance, leaving a little bit more along where the opening is, then flipped it right sides out, making sure that I've got the corners turned out nice and sharp with the help of a little needle. And then, you guessed it, more hand sewing. Now, was it all worth it? Was all the hand sewing worth it? Is this the perfect dress for fall or what? So when I first put this dress on, I felt a little unsure because there's a lot more ease than I'm used to. I think I've just been doing the 50s Dior New Look cinched waist silhouette for so long that anytime I have something that is not mildly suffocating, I'm like, oh my gosh, it's not fitting. Like, oh my gosh, it's too loose. But I think this is the way it's meant to fit. It's a late 60s A-line shift dress. This is the way it's supposed to fit. I'm supposed to have room for all my hot pot dinners in winter, and I need to start learning that. Which is like the whole point of me wanting to do the autumn-winter capsule wardrobe. So I would branch out and try different fabrics and try different styles. I can't remember the last time I owned something that's corduroy. It's probably when I was in elementary school. This is gonna be fun. I'm gonna have a lot of fun styling it, putting different layers on it. I think maybe I'll even do like a styling video. Yeah, let me know what you think about this dress. This is kind of a new thing for me. Let me know what you think about the buttonhole placement. I think It's spot on, so I hope you find that tip useful. And I guess I will see you again next week. I haven't quite decided on the projects that I'll be embarking on, but it's gonna be autumn-winter capsule related, obviously. I will see you again. Bye! Don't forget to like and subscribe.